So yeah, brilliant. So again, welcome everyone to this fourth and final reflection and this round of reflections on faith and art based on Caravaggio's painting Le Sette Opere della Misericordia, the 7 works of mercy. So far we've had the first presentation delivered by Giulia Privitelli, which introduced and explored Caravaggio's painting, which brought together the two contrasting elements of mercy and judgment. In our second discussion, Professor Nadia Delicata explored the 7 works of mercy in the Christian moral tradition, and in last week's presentation, Professor Anthony Frendo explored the development of the concept of mercy in Scripture. So for today, for our fourth session, Mr. Mark Cachia from the Diocesan Commission of Justice and Peace will discuss the relationship between mercy and justice in today's context, with a special reference to the local church's recent document, Yahad. So, Mark, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. In today's presentation, obviously following on the previous 3 presentations, I will talk about the works of justice works of mercy as presented by Caravaggio, but I will mostly focus on what it means to live mercy in today's world. I gave a title to my presentation, which is Merciful Politics, and it's tongue-in-cheek and not, because we don't usually associate politics with mercy. There are many ways to describe politics. Merciful is probably not something we associate readily with politics, whether in Malta or abroad. So what does it mean for us as Christians, in this case, obviously, from a Christian point of view, to be merciful in our political life? And I will use, obviously, political life in a broad sense. Towards the end of the presentation, I will say something about politics with a small p, politics with a capital P. And what does it mean to be merciful in the public space? What does it mean to be merciful out there? So not just within our communities, not just in church, but out there. And the subtitle already says something about the direction I will be taking. I will be talking about just mercy. As an introduction to this presentation, I went back, well, nearly 20 years ago, publication, the process which was held in Malta around the Diocesan Synod, came up with one of the documents on justice. And it had these very interesting words to say about charity and justice. Why am I presenting these? Because when we speak about the Opere della Misericordia, what comes in mind are these gestures of mercy towards those who are thirsty, those who are hungry, prisoners, acts of mercy. And the Diocesan Synod spoke that obviously giving charity is essential, but it's not enough. We have to go deeper. We have to ask questions. This for me is fundamental when it comes to our work as Christians in today's world, asking the right questions and relentlessly, I would say, keeping up the pressure in terms of asking ourselves the real questions, the difficult questions. This is the work of justice. The Synod says, when we're giving charity, we're obviously providing a service, food, clothing, etc., and we're responding to immediate needs. Immediate needs which comes from social injustice. The work of justice is orientated towards public action, political engagement, economic issues, and also collective, so that a change takes place. A change, this is also an important word. I highlighted it, it's not highlighted in the original text. This is the road which leads us to tackle the causes of social injustices. So when we speak about mercy, I think one of the dangers we have to avoid is to just be happy with these occasional acts of charity, which are essential. Essential means obviously that they have to be done, but they're not sufficient. Christmas is around the corner. Now everyone will be in generous mode. There will be fundraisers. I think Christian charity, which always includes justice, and Christian mercy, the acts of mercy we have been speaking about over the last four weeks, obviously cannot never be limited to these one-off gestures. I think that Jesus himself and Pope Francis is now giving us a very good example of this. In a way, he did practice prophetic politics, what I call prophetic politics. Obviously, he was not a candidate for any general election. But with what he said, and also with his concrete gestures, including of mercy, his acts were political. He was saying something about the social injustice, the root cause of social injustices, obviously in his time, and he was so in this way practicing prophetic and I would say merciful politics, also by asking these famous questions I mentioned at the beginning, these unsettling questions. And let's be honest with ourselves. The real questions when it comes to justice, when it comes to politics, when it comes to the way we are living together, to the way we are treating each other, the real questions are unsettling. If they're not unsettling, it means that we're not asking the right questions. There's a sort of holy restlessness. We see this in the gospel, Jesus moving around, meeting people, in a way, never resting. We have to ask ourselves, do we live this holy restlessness when it comes to injustice? Or as I just said a few seconds ago, are we just happy with the one-off which settles our conscience and then we move to other things? Do we live this holy restlessness, which is obviously not easy to live because it's tiring. It can tire us out, it can lead to burnout if obviously not lived in the proper way. But there is, I believe, a certain holy restlessness which can be lived according to the gospel model. The question is, can we open our hearts? This is, I repeat, we see this in the gospel, but this is, this is my interpretation. This is what Pope Francis is trying to do with his ministry. And when I say ministry, it's not only his words, but also his gestures, which are, as you know, so powerful. Can we open our hearts, our eyes, our mind to the suffering in the world around us, as God does? Be merciful as your Father is merciful. And this is also the difficult part, will we change to respond to it? That's why the questions of justice, links to mercy, are so unsettling, because they provoke a reaction from those who are profiting from situations of injustice, and that's why Jesus ended up on the cross. But they are also unsettling for us, because they unsettle us from where we are. They urge us to move, they urge us to change, and thus they are unsettling. Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, which basically sometimes I remind myself to go and reread this founding document of his papacy, because everything in a way is contained there. Everything he said and did over the last 10 years basically is contained in germ form there. He invites us to enter into the reality of other people's lives and know the power of tenderness. In many of his speeches, he associates tenderness with mercy. Whenever we do so, and I repeat, tenderness for me is the opposite of this hardness of heart, which also can be described as the opposite of mercy, hard hearts. Whenever we do so, whenever we enter into other people's lives with this tenderness, our lives become wonderfully complicated. This is an extraordinary turn of phrase. There is always paradox here, there is tension, because once again, we don't usually associate wonderful with complicated. But this is what the Pope is asking us to do. Now, mercy. I think when we talk about mercy in political life and in general, so I'm using political, as I said, in a general sense here, there is the risk of being misunderstood, and we'll come to that a bit later. But if my proposition here is to associate justice with mercy, there is also, I think, in politics, and here let's for a moment focus on politics, electoral politics. There is also, or activist politics, there is also the risk of working for justice and leaving aside mercy. So having a very good goal in itself, promoting a more just society, a more inclusive society, but in a certain way which excludes mercy. And I am here quoting, the first three quotes here are taken from this extraordinary book. If some of you following this presentation are encouraged to read this book, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, I think my talk will be successful because it's really one of the books which has really impacted the way I see this aspect of mercy, this aspect of justice. It's beautifully written by this lawyer, American lawyer, who has worked now for many years with prisoners on death row, so prisoners who are waiting to be sentenced to death. And in this book, he basically shares his personal journey about how he enters this world, and also how this journey is affected by his faith. He's a Christian, not a Catholic, but he's a Christian, and really it's extraordinarily powerful as a book, as a testimony. And Brian Stevenson says that an absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community. So the absence of mercy has an impact not only on an individual, but on a whole community. Fear and anger, even caused by righteous anger, let's call it that way, but not in the sense you presented a few months ago. Anger, justified anger, I would say, more than righteous anger. Justified anger can make us vindictive and abusive, unjust and unfair, if disconnected from this mercy. And we end up condemning ourselves as much as we victimize others. And obviously it's the American context here, but we can recognize some of the traits he describes here. We've become so fearful and vengeful that we've thrown away children, discarded the disabled, and sanctified the imprisonment of the sick and the weak, not because they are a threat to public safety or beyond rehabilitation, but because we think that it makes us seem tough and less broken. Because mercy is seen as weak. So that's why we hesitate to introduce the theme of mercy in public discourse. We've submitted to the harsh, once again, this harshness, I believe, the opposite of mercy, which we see so much around us in the way I was going to say dialogue, but it's not dialogue. We speak to each other in our differences. We shout at each other and we insult each other, even on social media especially. We've submitted to this harsh instinct to crush, there's violence here, to crush those among us whose brokenness is most visible. But simply punishing the broken only ensures that they remain broken, and we do too. There is no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity. So what Brian Stevenson is saying here is that when we practice justice, even, I repeat, justified anger against grave injustices, and we forget mercy, we all end up suffering. We all end up broken. And as I was preparing this talk, what came to mind are also some of the social justice movements, and in America, but which obviously are present in all over the world. And I tend to agree with many of these social justice movements in their aims of what they're trying to promote. However, I don't know if you've heard of this term, cancel culture. Sometimes even these movements fall victims to this type of extremism, whereby someone who said something wrong, admittedly wrong, 10 years ago, is basically cancelled, is disinvited from public whatever, to give public lectures, even if this person recognized his or her mistake. And what strikes me here, I repeat, without going into detail because it's quite a complex issue, what strikes me about this way of dealing with past mistakes is how different this is from our Christian way of allowing for redemption, allowing for people to change. In some of these movements, I repeat, taken to the extreme, change is not allowed, redemption is not allowed. If you made a mistake once, you're out. And this is obviously, I repeat, far away from our Christian way of even dealing with past mistakes or present failings. Pope Francis in Misericordia was the document he wrote to launch the Year of Mercy, says, perhaps we have long since forgotten how to show and live the way of mercy. And this is, I think, an interesting point here, because we have, obviously, the painting also of Caravaggio focuses on acts of charity. I think the challenge, obviously, without forgetting the necessary acts, is to see how we're going to adopt a way of living, so not limited to one-off acts, to show and live the way of mercy, not once a day, but our whole life. How can it be marked by mercy? However, continues the Pope, without a witness to mercy, life becomes fruitless and sterile, as if sequestered in a barren desert. So that's, put it then this way, to simplify, that's justice, the temptation of justice without mercy. At the same time, at the opposite extreme, we can understand mercy as this soft virtue. Okay, let bygones be bygones, let's forget, let's put everything under the carpet. Well, that's also not mercy understood in the Christian sense. And this, I would say, in the church, this temptation here we're tackling now is even more present than the first one. Mercy is not a soft virtue, correctly understood. It's not kumbaya, hugs for everyone, and let's move on. And we hear this a lot. Let bygones, I repeat, let bygones be bygones, let's not mention it again. Let's avoid conflict. It really annoys me, but this is something which, I repeat, in church circles, we tend to meet, I wouldn't say on a daily basis, but yeah. Pope Francis, in the same document related to the Year of Mercy, says clearly, justice and mercy are not two contradictory realities, but two dimensions of a single reality. Very important. It's a single reality, not even two realities, one after the other. They're one reality, obviously different dimensions, that unfolds progressively. There is a journey here until it culminates in the fullness of love. So there cannot be a journey towards the fullness of love without mercy. Okay, I think in Christian circles we tend to agree in principle on this, but even the absence of justice prevents us from moving towards the fullness of love. Fratelli Tutti, 241. Very, these numbers 241 till 244 more or less are very important to understand what we're saying here. Those who suffer injustice have to defend strenuously. Interesting, the language. He doesn't say they have the option, they're justified. They have to defend strenuously their own rights and those of their family. Why? Precisely because they must preserve the dignity they have received as a loving gift from God. I remind you that dignity stands bang in the middle of Catholic social teaching. Everything is built around the human dignity which unites us all. And the Pope here is saying that we have to defend ourselves against injustice, even justice we suffer personally, because that is linked to our own dignity. It's our duty. The Pope continues, 244, Fratelli Tutti, when conflicts, is also an extremely important document, quote, sorry, when conflicts are not resolved but kept hidden or buried in the past, silence can lead to complicity in grave misdeeds and sins. Authentic reconciliation does not flee from conflict, but is achieved in conflict. I think all of us here who have had experiences in communities, in church institutions, can bring to mind a concrete example of when this was not lived in this way, of when we tried to achieve reconciliation outside of conflict and not in conflict, with mercy, with truth, and with justice. And the last quote here, Pope Francis is addressing the National Reconciliation Encounter in Colombia. Obviously, Colombia is a country where, for a number of years, till this very day, although now thankful things have improved, it has been ravaged by kind of civil war. So he's speaking to a community who knows what lack of reconciliation means. Truth, in fact, is an inseparable companion of justice and mercy. Inseparable, once again, cannot just have one and discard the two. All three belong, all three together are essential to building peace. Each, moreover, prevents the other from being altered. It's beautiful. You know, keeping the three together means that justice it remains Christian justice. Once we remove one of the three, everything falls apart. So what does it mean for us to live in this way, to live by holding intention through justice and mercy without forgetting truth? I truly believe that we are all called in our different scenarios and different circumstances. We all have a public life in one way or another. And we are called to be prophets and mystics. This is a quote from Margaret Silf, a writer in Ignatian spirituality. The mystic who intuits what is really going on beneath the surface of things, notices the divine amid the ordinary, and sees others with God's eyes. And the prophet addresses what the mystic sees, challenging all that is threatening to undermine humanity's journey towards life in all its fullness. I think what this quote, especially what she says about what it means to be prophetic in our everyday life, in our public life, especially, is extremely helpful. Challenging all that is threatening to undermine humanity's journey towards life in all its fullness. And we all know that there are a number of issues which we see around us, which challenge this journey. And I ask the question here, politics with a capital P or small p politics? Pope Francis encourages us to meddle as Catholics in politics. And he understands politics, yes, in the narrow sense of electoral politics. But I strongly believe that in a way, practically everything is politics. Even the way we live as a family. For example, as a family, what we buy, what we don't buy. once again, Pope Francis insists on the power we have as consumers to favor one, I don't know, local produce for environmental reasons and not other type of produce. That in itself is political, might not change, I don't know, the results of a bill presented to Parliament, but it is politics. You are sending a message. You are, taking the definition of Margaret itself, you are nourishing something which you believe leads to a more just and sustainable society in this case. So let's not think that politics has to be signing a petition. Yes, by all means. Writing a letter. Yes, why not? Being active in a political party also. But everything we do, even the way we behave in our different workplaces, in a way, everything at the end of the day is politics, because it is sending a message about what type of society we want to have, how we want to live together, and that is politics. That is politics. Kind of relationship, the kind of structure we want for our community. Talking of merciful politics, I think is in a way, is a challenge, asking us what style of politics do we adopt, what style of politics do we promote. I believe that the style is as important as the content. Before with.
It seems that Mark has been cut off from the internet.
Hello.
You're back. Okay.
Sorry.
Now we're hearing you.
I don't know.
We missed out a bit.
Okay, I'll just. You're seeing the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I was saying the style for me is. Sorry. The style of doing politics is as important as the content, in the sense that if we fight for just causes in a certain way, it might not be the Christian way of proceeding. And I said, let's look at the way Jesus himself dealt with opposition. Jesus himself dealt with difficult people, difficult situations. How did he do this? What was his style of dealing with these situations? The question to ask is, are we stone throwers or stone catchers? Jesus certainly was not a stone thrower. He tended to be a stone catcher. When people found themselves receiving end of harsh judgments, he tended to defend them. His style was certainly that of just mercy. And let's remember, when out there and also dealing with politics, with people who, in our opinion, maybe are not contributing to the common good. Let's remember something, in a way, Julia mentioned, and I think even Nadia in her presentation, that everyone needs mercy. In the Caravaggio painting, there is this ambiguity, you know, that it's not clear cut that there are good and bad persons. It's not clear cut. Everyone needs mercy, even those handing out mercy. Mercy in a way is always messy. It's always risky. it's never deserved. It's rarely clear cut. And I know even myself, I prefer clear cut situations. But when we're dealing with mercy, with charity, with love, I would say, there is always an element of messiness. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't, I repeat, call out injustice when it needs to be called out. But once again, how do we do it? And without forgetting ever that we ourselves have received mercy, that we ourselves are in need of mercy. It's only in the American films that sometimes it's so clear-cut who are the goodies and who are the baddies. In real life, and this is once again our Catholic tradition, we are all sinners in need of mercy. There is strength, once again a quote from Just Mercy, there is strength, a power even in understanding brokenness. Because embracing our brokenness creates a need and desire for mercy, and perhaps a corresponding need to show mercy. This is where we can meet with our fellow human beings, in our vulnerability, in our brokenness. And unfortunately, this is so absent in the public sphere. So few public people apologize nowadays, because that's seen as weakness. So we keep on shouting at each other, crushing each other, and never meeting in this space of vulnerability and shared brokenness. One of my also favorite authors, J.R.R. Tolkien, I found this quote from a letter he sent to one of his fans discussing The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings, one of the things which, well, I mean, it's a masterpiece. There are a lot of things which can be said about this book, but once again, the characters are not simplistic, you know. They are complicated, they are complex, because this is what us human beings are. We are complex, even when it comes to deciphering who is good and who is bad in Tolkien's books. Sometimes it's not so clear cut. And he said that he tried in his book, in this case, the trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, to help us see the damaged good in the corrupt. Because even those who end up, I don't know, Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, for those who are familiar, we realize over the trilogy that Gollum wasn't always Gollum, and still, after all those years of suffering, there is a lot of good in him. And this, I think, when it comes to our presence in public life, is a challenge we have to take seriously. I repeat, it doesn't mean forgetting the truth and twisting reality, but meeting the other person and not writing anyone off, and believing that the other person also has good in him or her. And in this journey in the public sphere, we also have to practice what I call merciful patience. And maybe here is the moment to speak very briefly about what the Commission, the Justice and Peace Commission, issued a few months ago, this document called Yahad, which in the first part exposes the wounds in our society and people who have suffered or who are suffering because of the injustices being perpetrated in our midst. We mention very clear victims of injustice, of violence, Daphne, Miriam, who died in her home, Lassane, and then the fourth victim, faceless victim, and faceless not because he or she doesn't exist, but because they represent women, children, people who are trying to promote the common good and find themselves isolated, people who are not well connected and in our whatever society dominated by clientelism end up always at the back of the queue. And in the second part, we propose a number of virtues from our tradition, from our Catholic tradition, which can help us, once again, in terms of style, but also in content, can help us, they provide the tools not to lose hope, And we propose the values of truth, the values of creative courage. We need a lot of courage not to lose hope and be creative, not say things have always been the same, nothing will change. We propose the value and virtue of temperance. And the last one is merciful patience. Because yes, anyone who has been involved in public life at all levels, when I say public life here, can be activism, can be politics in the sense of party politics. Well, we know that we need a lot of patience, apart from the mercy I have been mentioning now during my presentation. We need a lot of patience with ourselves. We need a lot of patience, not only with those who maybe are or oppose our ideas, but also with our fellow travelers, those who in principle share our views, our values, our vision. We need a lot of patience. And we need a lot of patience because often, in this struggle, because it is a struggle, success can be quite limited, let's put it that way. We don't see anything tangible, maybe changing the way we want it to change. This I learned, obviously, during my years also working at the Jesuit Refugee Service, where the system, let's call it the system, hasn't much changed in the last few years. This year we celebrate 20 years since the first major boat arrivals. So sometimes I used to question, why all this effort? Why all this effort in advocacy? And we always, even as a team, used to ask ourselves, but what is our definition of success? You know that in the business world, and we're always looking for smart goals and objectives. Sometimes we have to ask ourselves as Christians, how do we define success? Just last Sunday, we celebrated Christ the King, triumphant, but the gospel reading was Christ on the cross. And we know this, but sometimes we always have to remind ourselves that he is our King. And in terms of earthly success, well, not much to show for all his efforts. And yet that is whom we're called to follow. And I took this quote from Greg Boyle, a Jesuit working with people who have been in prison and to set up this social enterprise. And he writes, success and failure ultimately have little to do with living the gospel. Jesus stood with the outcasts until they were welcomed or until he was crucified, whichever came first. And what about, I call it here, the community level? So that may be more the activist public sphere, politics, maybe more with the capital P. What about the smaller sphere of our families, our Christian communities, CLC, if you're part of a CLC? What does it mean to be merciful? And the title of the slide is "To love is to resist." You can change it to be merciful is to resist. And I took this quote from this author, George Monbiot, not Christian as far as I know, but he's an activist, an environmental activist. And he wrote, in an age of hate, to love is to resist. And I have this quote on one of my walls at home, because I really think that it says something real and profound. What it's saying is that every time we love, going back now to the acts of mercy, they are acts of love. And hopefully they won't be one-off acts, but they will be a way of living, a style. Every time we love, we are resisting a culture which, as the Pope says, discards, throws away. By putting people in the center with concrete acts of love, we are saying no to a certain culture of waste. We are resisting, and that is obviously very political. Let's not underestimate the, I put it in inverted commas, the symbolic, inverted commas, because symbolic here is not just a simple, an empty, light symbol. Symbolic, obviously, especially in our Catholic tradition, has a very important, heavy meaning. The symbolic powers of acts of recognition. Once again, when I recognize, I don't know, asylum seekers, prisoners, people who are normally marginalized in our society, I am recognizing them concretely. They become acts of resistance. Julia, in her first presentation, spoke about those who are barely visible. One way of loving, one way of resisting a certain culture is to bring into the light those who are invisible, those who are hardly visible. And they are hardly visible because we make them visible. Someone makes them visible. Now, who makes them invisible? That's a whole new, obviously, question, and a difficult question, because we go into the structural sins. In a way, many people are responsible, no one is responsible, but we are all responsible for pushing these people into the shadows. Let's take it upon ourselves to bring them out of the shadows and put them at the center. Once again, the same way Jesus not only recognized the outcasts of his time, the lepers, the woman who was bleeding, just call to mind how many times he recognized forcefully, in a tangible, even physical way, these people. And he literally put them at the center of attention, literally. Not only did he recognize them, but he put them at the center. The experience of opening our hearts to those living on the outermost fringes of society, fringes which modern society itself creates, which we create in our in a way. To conclude, this challenge, this calling to live mercy in our communities, in our public life, in our workplaces. Mercy understood the way I have presented it, not as a light virtue, soft virtue, which forgets justice, forgets truth, but true mercy. It is really a never-ending struggle, and I was struck by the way Caravaggio also paints the two angels on the top of the painting. It is a struggle. It is not a decision we take once in our lives. Okay, I'm going to try and be merciful. It's really a never-ending and ongoing struggle, which has to become concrete in daily gestures and decisions. It's a question of deciding. Probably the default would be to forget mercy, because that's where society often pushes us. So if the default is that direction, taking a different direction of mercy, justice, and truth, takes a conscious and daily decision. Mercy involves these acts of charity, and this is a definition I found which struck me. Mercy involves acts of charity addressing suffering, and acts of justice addressing the root causes of that suffering. So this, in a way, goes back to the first slide, the reference to the Synod, the Maltese Synod. Both acts of charity, very necessary, but also acts of justice. And the attitude, and what we should never forget, unless we want to fall into hubris, into lack of humility, gratitude, because we have gratefully received God's mercy. We are at the receiving end of God's mercy. Let's not forget that. not think ourselves always as those giving mercy. We have received mercy. We need mercy, not only from God, but from those around us. When we forget that, we're in trouble. When we remember that, we can live everything in gratitude, and we humbly, I emphasize the word humbly, embody and extend it to others in our daily lives. And the Psalm, obviously, Psalm 85:10, mercy and truth have met each other, justice and peace have kissed. These four, mercy, truth, justice, we didn't mention a lot of peace, but we mentioned a bit reconciliation. We find them in the same verse of this psalm, and it can be, in a way, a good way to end this presentation. Thank you.